The wind hammered the corrugated tin walls of Outpost 4, a relentless, shrieking pressure that vibrated through the floorboards. Perched on the highest jagged ridge of the range, the structure groaned under the constant assault of the gale. Inside the radio room, the air was stagnant and cold. Miller sat hunched over the main console, his back to the reinforced door. He did not move. He listened to the rhythm of the wind, waiting for the structural steel to buckle. It was a sound he had lived with for weeks, but tonight the pitch was different, sharp and insistent. He stared at the blank frequency gauge, waiting for a signal that never came. He reached out, pushed a heavy lever to lock the desk drawer, and listened to the click echo in the cramped space. There was no other sound, no hum of machinery, no distant footfalls, no human voice. Just the wind, the heavy, suffocating weight of the fog against the glass, and the absolute certainty that he was the only living thing for miles in any direction. He gripped the edge of the console until his knuckles turned white, forcing his breath to slow, waiting for the storm to break. The radio dial flickered. A sharp, rhythmic green glow washed over the desk, stretching Miller's shadow across the wall until it resembled something elongated and jagged. He watched the light pulse, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that seemed disconnected from the storm outside. Every time the glow dipped, the corners of the room vanished, then reappeared, making the desk appear to drift inches closer to him. Miller stared at the dial until his eyes burned. He reached for his pen, the plastic casing smooth and cold against his fingertips. He began to tap. Once, twice. The sound was a sharp, percussive intrusion against the heavy silence of the outpost. He stopped, holding his breath, waiting for the wind to answer. It did not. The silence was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums.
He tapped again, faster this time, a frantic, irregular rhythm that mirrored the flickering green light.
He tried to focus on the console, but the shadows on the wall continued to shift, swaying in a way that defied the stillness of the room. He leaned back, the metal chair groaning, and realized he was counting the seconds between the flickers, trapped in the rhythm of the machine. Miller shifted his weight, his eyes sliding from the rhythmic pulse of the radio to the corner of the desk. A leather-bound logbook lay there, half buried under a stack of outdated signal charts. He reached for it, the leather cracked and dry under his palm, shedding flakes of dust onto the metal surface. He pulled it into the green light. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the edges, smelling of damp earth and stale tobacco. He flipped the cover back, and the binding groaned in protest. The handwriting inside was a mess of jagged, overlapping lines that clawed across the paper, growing tighter and more erratic with every page. Some entries were smeared, as if written with shaking hands. Others were pressed so deep into the fibers that the paper had torn. It was a record of someone losing their grip, a history of isolation etched in ink. Miller ran his thumb over the indentations, feeling the frantic energy of the pen. The sequence of entries was broken, skipping days, then doubling back, creating a timeline of confusion. He reached the bottom of a page where the ink trailed off into a dark, ink-blotted void. He braced himself, turned the page, and focused on the final, shaky scrawl. Miller narrowed his eyes, forcing his vision to sharpen against the erratic pulse of the radio light. The final entry was written in a single, unwavering line, starkly different from the chaotic scrawls that preceded it.
It read, "The third watch never ends." He stared at the words,
his pulse drumming against his fingertips. He leaned closer, the scent of aged paper filling his lungs,
and traced the ink with his index finger. The phrasing felt less like a note and more like a sentence. He looked back at the earlier pages, checking the dates, but the timeline remained a jagged, broken mess.
He blinked, trying to find a pattern or a name, but found nothing but the same stark, terrifying repetition. A cold draft crawled up his spine, unrelated to the wind outside. He pulled his hand away from the book as if the surface were burning. The silence of the outpost suddenly felt different.
It was no longer empty. It felt expectant, as if the room itself were holding its breath.
Waiting for something to arrive. He pushed the logbook away, his movements jerky and uncoordinated.
The warning was not just a record of the past. It was a map of the future he had just stepped into. Miller stood up, his chair legs screeching against the concrete. He moved toward the observation window, his steps heavy and measured. Outside, the world had vanished. A thick, opaque fog had pressed itself against the reinforced glass.
Clinging to the surface like a wet, living shroud. It did not drift, it pulsed. He reached out, palm flat against the glass, and the cold seeped into his skin, numbing his fingertips.
He pressed harder, trying to force his vision into the gray void. But the fog seemed to thicken in direct response to his presence.
Swirling against the exterior pane, as if sensing his gaze from within. It felt intentional.
The outpost was no longer a station on a ridge. It was an island being slowly submerged by a white, soundless tide. He wiped a streak through the condensation, but the moisture reformed instantly,
obscuring the world again. The walls of the room felt closer than they had a moment ago. Every breath he took seemed to pull the stale, recycled air from the corners of the small space, leaving him gasping in the tightening vacuum.
Outside, the fog did not just hide the ridge, it claimed it, inch by agonizing inch,
until the border between the outpost and the wilderness began to blur and dissolve into a single, suffocating mass.
The silence shattered. A jagged, ear-piercing burst of static erupted from the radio console, sending a shockwave of white noise through the room. Miller flinched, his shoulders locking tight as he spun toward the desk. The radio dial flickered with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. Before he could reach for the volume knob, another sound cut through the static. A low, rhythmic, metallic scraping. It was coming from outside, vibrating through the corrugated tin walls of the outpost. It sounded like steel dragging against jagged rock, slow and deliberate. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. The cadence was too consistent to be the wind. Miller stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the radio, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scraping sound grew louder, traveling along the exterior ridge toward the main entrance. Every metallic vibration rattled the pens on his desk, causing them to roll against the logbook. He dropped his gaze to the floor, noticing the fine dust dancing in the air from the wall's vibrations. The intrusion was no longer distant. It was right against the exterior plating, searching for a seam. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white, as the scraping stopped directly outside the door. Miller leaned forward, his torso hovering inches above the desk. The silence outside was heavier now, pressing against the tin walls with a weight that made his ears pop. He needed to know what was on the other side. He reached for the heavy metal microphone, his movements slow and agonizingly precise.
He did not want to disturb the air. He did not want to create a single vibration that might travel through the floorboards. As his fingertips brushed the cold,
textured surface of the transmitter, he stopped. He pulled his hand back, retreating into the shadows of the desk. He realized that the silence outside was not an absence of noise, but a waiting period.
It was listening. He held his breath, his chest tight, his lungs burning for oxygen that he dared not inhale.
Every muscle in his arm locked into place, rigid and unyielding. He watched the radio dial. It flickered in the dark, a dying green pulse that illuminated the fine layer of sweat on his forehead. He did not touch the microphone. He did not speak. He stayed anchored to the spot, his hand hanging in mid-air, trembling as he waited for the next sound to break the stillness.
His hand hung in the air for a heartbeat longer, then retracted. Miller did not look back at the window.
He dropped his gaze to his right hip. The holster sat against his side.
A familiar weight that suddenly felt like his only lifeline. He reached down, his fingers brushing the fabric of his belt before finding the sidearm.
His palms were slick with moisture, beads of sweat tracking down his skin, but the weapon was cold. The temperature difference shocked his nerves.
He kept his movements agonizingly slow, sliding his thumb over the safety release.
The mechanism clicked a sound that seemed deafening in the absolute stillness of the room. He did not pull the weapon out completely. He let his grip tighten around the grip, feeling the hard, textured metal bite into his palm.
The steel was freezing, a sharp, unyielding sensation that cut through the haze of his racing thoughts.
He shifted his weight, testing the floorboards for any telltale creak. With his right hand locked onto the sidearm and his left steadying the desk, he braced himself.
He was no longer just a listener in the dark. He was ready to meet whatever was dragging itself toward the door.
The cold metal of the sidearm acted as a bridge, pulling his mind away from the tin walls and toward the dense, suffocating pine forest. The room seemed to dissolve, replaced by the scent of damp needles and rotting bark. Miller was no longer in the chair. He was back in the line, boots sinking into soft,
mossy earth. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in thin, silver needles,
casting long shadows that shifted with every step he took. Behind him, the rest of the squad moved in perfect, rhythmic synchronization. He could see their silhouettes, sharp and elongated against the pale ground. They were moving with purpose, scanning the dark gaps between the trees. The air in the forest was heavy, static, and cold. He remembered the exact sensation of the branch ends brushing his shoulders as he pushed through a thicket.
There was no wind then, only the sound of their own breathing and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot.
He checked the spacing between them, his eyes tracking the dark perimeter. Every shadow in the forest seemed to hold a potential threat, a shape that did not belong. He pressed forward, his body locked in the familiar, tense rhythm of the patrol, unaware that the silence was about to shatter. The rhythm held, left foot, right foot, the steady cadence of boots on forest floor. Then,
the darkness ahead tore open. A flash white, blinding, and absolute erupted from the dense brush to the left. It was not a single spark, but a continuous strobe of violence. Miller dropped. He did not think, he reacted. The ground slammed into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. The air turned acrid, smelling of sulfur and burnt ozone. Everywhere he looked, the night was fracturing. Muzzle flashes danced like jagged lightning between the pines, revealing brief, terrifying glimpses of the chaos. The trees themselves seemed to be screaming as bullets tore through bark and branch. He scrambled toward the base of a large oak, his hands clawing into the dirt. The forest floor, which had been silent seconds ago, now roared with the rhythmic thud of automatic fire. He could not see the shooters, only the blinding bursts of light that illuminated the falling needles. He pressed his face into the cold mud, his heart hammering against his ribs as the woods erupted into a fever of light and sound. The ambush had arrived with the force of a landslide, turning the quiet patrol into a killing zone. Miller tried to raise his head, but a volley of lead hammered the bark above his ear, showering him in splinters and grit. The roar of the gunfire was deafening, a relentless metallic pulse that drowned out all rational thought.
To his right, a man lunged from behind a cluster of ferns, desperate to reach the secondary line of defense.
The movement was a mistake. A cluster of flashes bloomed in the dark. The man jerked mid-stride, his body collapsing into the damp undergrowth with a heavy, wet thud. Then came the sound.
It started as a raw, guttural cry of shock, a desperate plea for help that cut through the thunder of the weapons.
It climbed in pitch, sharp and jagged, piercing the night with unbearable clarity. For a second,
it was the only thing in the world. Then, a sudden, violent gust of wind howled through the clearing,
swallowing the sound as if it had never existed. The scream vanished, replaced by the hollow whistle of air between the pines. Miller lay frozen in the mud, his chest heaving, his fingers digging into the frozen earth. The gunfire ceased,
leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. There was no movement, no return fire.
Only the cold, indifferent wind moving through the trees, carrying the weight of a loss that could not be undone.
The heavy silence of the memory evaporated, replaced by the low, steady hum of the radio console. Miller blinked, the dim green light of the dial washing over his face. He sat motionless, the remnants of the forest floor still vivid in his mind, but the reality of the small, cramped room pressed in on him. He reached for his pen,
ready to log the quiet, when the air broke. A sharp, rhythmic crackle erupted from the speaker. It was not the random static of the storm. It was a pattern. Click, click, click. Pause, click. Miller stiffened. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk.
Knuckles white. He knew that sequence. He had memorized it during the deployment briefing 3 months ago.
It was the emergency identification code for the squad that had been wiped out on the first day of the operation.
Officially, they were dead. Officially, their transmitters had been destroyed in the initial assault.
Yet, the signal persisted, looping with a cold, mechanical precision that defied logic. He leaned forward,
his ear inches from the speaker, listening to the impossible. The rhythmic pulse filled the room, sounding less like a transmission and more like a heartbeat from a grave. A tremor started in his shoulder,
spreading down to his hand as he realized the signal was not just active. It was broadcasting from somewhere just outside the outpost walls.
The radio continued its steady, looping pulse. Click, 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 pause. Every repetition felt like a hammer striking iron.
Miller reached out to silence the device, but his hand stopped midair.
The sound wasn't just coming from the speaker anymore. A distinct metallic scrape echoed from the ridge outside, vibrating through the thin metal walls of the outpost. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like heavy iron dragging over stone.
Miller shoved his chair back. The metal legs shrieked against the concrete floor, a jarring,
high-pitched protest that cut through the room. He didn't wait for the sound to die down. He was already on his feet, his balance unsteady, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took a sharp, jagged breath and lunged toward the window.
The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with the smell of ozone and damp metal.
He gripped the edge of the console to steady himself, then pushed off, his boots clattering on the floorboards as he moved toward the glass. Outside, the fog pressed against the pane, white and impenetrable. He raised a hand to clear the condensation, his fingers trembling, his eyes locked on the darkness beyond the glass. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, closer, as if something out there was testing the strength of the walls. Miller pressed his palm against the cold glass, wiping away the thick layer of condensation.
His breath hitched as he squinted into the swirling white void. The wind had died down, leaving a hollow,
unnatural stillness that felt heavier than the storm. At first, there was only the gray, featureless wall of mist.
Then, the fog parted. A dark, jagged silhouette materialized on the slope, roughly 20 yards out.
It was low to the ground. It moved with a heavy, rhythmic drag,
leaving a deep furrow in the loose shale of the ridge. Miller leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching the pane.
He expected a mountain animal, perhaps a scavenger drawn by the radio interference. Instead,
he saw the unmistakable shape of a human form. Then, another shadow emerged from the mist to the left. A third appeared behind it. They were not walking. They were pulling their weight forward, limbs jerking in a slow,
discordant cadence that defied human anatomy. The metallic scraping sound flared again,
amplified by the silence. Miller watched, paralyzed, as the shapes continued their relentless, grinding ascent.
They were closing the distance, and the outpost provided no cover from what was coming up the slope.
The figures were within 10 feet of the reinforced wall. Miller saw the way they moved, not with purpose,
but with a mindless, twitching momentum. One shape reached out with a hand that looked shattered.
The fingers splayed and dragging through the grit. There was no sound of breath, only the wet,
rhythmic slap of dead weight against the stone. Miller recognized the jagged tear in the fabric of a sleeve, a detail he had seen 1,000 times on the patrol. It was the same squad, the same men who had vanished into the pine trees 3 days ago. They were pulling themselves upward with a sickening, grinding tenacity, their bodies angled at impossible degrees against the slope. A knee joint buckled,
then popped, but the figure didn't stop. It just hauled itself forward, leaving a dark, smeared trail on the shale.
The horror was not that they were attacking. It was that they were returning as broken. Hollow shells of the men he had known. Miller stumbled backward, his heel catching on a stray cable.
He scrambled to regain his balance, but his eyes remained fixed on the glass. One of the figures stopped.
It tilted its head, a slow mechanical rotation, and pressed a mud-caked face against the window. Miller scrambled away from the window, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He backed into the desk, the edge biting into his ribs, but he did not look away from the glass.
The silence in the room was suddenly shredded by a sharp electronic pop. The radio console flared with a brilliant, pulsing green light. Miller gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. A voice crackled through the speakers.
It was his own. "The third watch never ends," the radio broadcasted. It was the exact sentence he had muttered to himself hours ago, recorded and looped with a strange, metallic clarity.
Miller stared at the console, his pulse hammering against his throat. He reached out to silence the transmission,
but his hand froze inches from the dial. The voice continued, repeating his own words back to him, not just the sentence, but the exact cadence, the same hesitation, the same tremor of exhaustion.
The reality of the situation splintered. He was listening to his past self, while his present self stood paralyzed, trapped in a loop he could not break. The radio clicked, then began to broadcast the sound of his own breathing, amplified and distorted, filling the small room until it drowned out the wind. Miller remained motionless, his hands suspended in the air. The radio did not just play back his past, it began to mimic his present.
The speaker emitted a sharp,
jagged intake of breath that matched his own rhythmic gasps perfectly. He held his breath, waiting to see if the machine would follow suit.
The radio went silent for a single, agonizing second, then produced a soft,
synthetic exhale that mirrored his own release of air. It was not a recording anymore. It was an echo that refused to fade.
Miller felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the machine was learning him.
Sampling his panic in real time, he took a stuttering step back.
And the radio emitted a nearly identical scuff of his boot against the concrete floor. The proximity of the sound made his skin crawl. It was as if his own consciousness had been stripped away and repurposed by the device.
Every twitch of his fingers, every shift of his weight was being tracked, digitized,
and thrown back at him through the static. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the radio began to broadcast a low,
mocking hum that vibrated through the desk and up into his very bones.
The hum from the radio grew in pitch, a sharp, buzzing vibration that rattled the pens on the desk.
Miller could not stand the sight of the device anymore. It was no longer just a piece of equipment. It was a mirror reflecting his own undoing.
His fingers reached for the lamp switch,
his skin feeling cold and unresponsive. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the plastic toggle. If he killed the light,
he would be blind, but he would also be invisible. A final, distorted burst of his own voice crackled from the speaker.
Sounding like a plea for help, Miller slammed his thumb against the switch.
The lamp cut out instantly. The room vanished. Total, suffocating darkness replaced the green glow,
leaving him standing in a void where the only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart.
He pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until his boots touched the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut,
trying to purge the image of the radio from his mind. But in the absolute black,
his senses sharpened. He could hear the wind scouring the exterior walls, and underneath that, the faint, rhythmic scraping of something climbing the ridge toward the door. He was hidden, but he was not alone.
The darkness was absolute, yet the room was not empty. Across the desk, the radio dial flickered with a steady,
rhythmic green light. It pulsed like a heartbeat, expanding and contracting, casting sickly,
oscillating shadows that crawled across the floorboards. Miller held his breath, his chest burning.
His eyes locked on that singular, hypnotic glow. He dared not move,
fearing that even the shift of his weight would trigger another response from the machine. The silence of the outpost was heavy,
pressurized by the wind howling against the ridge outside. Then, the rhythmic pulse of the radio light skipped a beat.
A sound tore through the room, a heavy, metallic thud against the exterior door. It was not the wind.
It was deliberate. A slow, crushing impact that vibrated through the floor and into his soles.
Another knock followed, louder, closer, echoing through the thin metal walls of the radio room. The sound was not random. It was a demand for entry. Miller gripped his sidearm, the steel biting into his palm. As the knob of the door began to turn with agonizing, mechanical precision, the knocking did not stop. It grew heavier, each impact shaking the desk until the radio slid an inch toward the edge.
The knocking did not pause. It hammered against the metal door with a rhythmic, hollow cadence that vibrated through the frame of the outpost. Miller remained pinned to the floor,
his ears straining against the howling wind. Each strike was identical to the last, heavy, slow, and inevitable.
He remembered the logbook, the yellowed pages, the frantic warnings left by men who had sat in this same chair, listening to the same sound. He realized then that the knocking was not a breach. It was a transition. The door handle rattled, sliding back and forth in its casing, but he did not reach for it. He could not. His hand remained locked around the grip of his sidearm, useless in the face of what waited outside. The radio light pulsed one final time, a sharp flare of green that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, then died completely. The room was swallowed by a silence more terrifying than the noise. The knocking ceased, replaced by the sound of a heavy, metallic latch clicking open. Miller leaned his head back against the concrete wall and closed his eyes. The third watch had begun, and he knew now that it would never, ever end.